Thank you so much for being here, Professor.
My pleasure.
So last time I had a conversation with you was on September 28th, when I had a conversation with you regarding a video podcast that you created. And after that conversation, I realized that you were very passionate in the field of instructional technology, which leads to the first question that I have. What's your goals in using instructional technology in classroom settings?
A good question. It's very interesting. When we think of technology, particularly computerized technology, we think of information.
Right.
But I go beyond that. I think of the technology as allowing me to think through problems. There's a conceptual dimension that I think that the computer can allow us to employ for those purposes. And more than that, what I have found, particularly in the classroom, is that while I can be appealing to the students' ability to conceptualize issues by showing them visual images on the screen itself, in a sense, what it does is give an experiential dimension to the conceptualization of the issues we're dealing with, and that really reinforces, I think, their understanding.
Could you elaborate on why and how you use an application called Keynote, and especially the virtual museum that you actually created?
Right. Well, to explain that, I have to go back a few years. Back in around 1991, 1992, there was a thing called HyperCard, that was used on a Mac machine. I didn't have one. I was working on a PC. And so, but there was something else called Asymmetrics Toolbook. It was what we used to call authorware.
Right.
If you think of PowerPoint, it's really a presentational ware. But this was authorware, and it allowed me to create learning environments. It allowed me to open up fields, scroll bars, put scripts in behind icons, and it allowed me to try to develop an environment within the computer that enhanced the learning experience. There's so much information that is delivered in the classroom that could be placed within on a computer in advance, so that once the student has gone through that, then in the class we can have really quality time discussing the materials. And so that was in my background. That was 1992. I put that aside. Fast forward to the present.
Right.
Particularly with the use of Keynote, which is remarkable software. I use it in my classroom as a presentational ware, if you will. But I also it has what are known as hyperlinks that allow me to use it as authorware. And it actually allows me now, in the case of, you mentioned this virtual museum, to imagine, I call it the liquid architecture of ideas, the liquid architecture of ideas. And this idea of creating a virtual museum without walls on the computer, which is not limited by the physical space of the museum. And so I have in the virtual museum an avatar for us, and she takes us into the museum. And then we actually can interact with the list of artists and works and so forth. You can open up images. You can also begin to, I call it frames of engagement, a term that I'll use later, where you can frame our understanding of the work of art in terms of the biography of the artist, the historical conditions under which it was done. So many things could be available to you in the computer that one cannot have in the museum. It really has to do with not so much the exhibition of a work of art, but its reception.
Experiencing.
Exactly. It's that experiential dimension that's really key. And that's really the basis of my own teaching, is really it's not so much a learning outcome, right, outside, beyond what goes on in the classroom, but it's the educational experience within the classroom that I focus on.
Right. It seems to me that your focus is a lot about the experiential aspect of the classroom and transforming a conceptual idea into experiential work.
Exactly.
With those goals set in your mind, do you try to convey that in a syllabus or any kind of format where students first experience your class?
Well, actually, the syllabus itself, particularly for my class on African American art, I spent several pages before we actually get to a list of the work of arts we're looking at.
Right.
And it's really, the term I will come back to over and over again, and it's really the principle that I operate on. It's I use the term frames of engagement, whether it be within the syllabus or the materials I present in class or something external to it like potentially a virtual museum. It's how we frame our understanding of the material. There's a famous philosopher, Jacques Derrida, who once said, remember, every framework can be a frame-up. So in the sense that, think of your glasses. You're looking through your glasses. It brings the world into focus.
Right.
And so I'm looking at those lenses through which we, conceptual lenses, if you will, through which we take up the subjects we're teaching, you see, and reflecting upon that. And so I will make use of things in the syllabus as well as other, and especially in my presentations that get us to reflect upon how we're taking up, in this case, the work of art within another culture.
Last time we had a conversation, I remember you mentioning some of the projects that you did in the African American art studies. Could you elaborate on some of the activities that you had students go through in that class?
Actually, the one thing that I'm really most proud of, at least proud of my students on, was the final project. And it's getting away from the little blue books we have to give tests. The course on African American art is called the Pro Seminar. It's 100 level, with the focus on interaction in the classroom with the works of art and in conversations with each other in the classroom. In fact, on the very first day, I set the rules for the class. I said, in this class we may differ, but we will not disagree because we're not interested in agreement. We're interested in hearing each other. And by hearing each other, we could also understand how we are each positioned differently to take up the world, to take up the work of art, you see. And the final project that I had my students put together, and we had one evening in which they presented it, was using what we can call a multimodal narrative.
Right.
It used text, image, and music, putting them together. They could use either PowerPoint or Keynote to do this, to do a presentation. And it has to do with not just repeating the information they learned in class, absorbed and so forth, but it has to do with several things. One, it could be their own view of the works of art that we looked at and the lives of the artists that we discussed. It could also be telling their own story in relationship to the works of art, what works of art really meant something to them, and to weave their story into the stories of the lives of these artists. Or it could, and in one example I'm very, very excited about, it's called The Black Experience at Hamilton College. 2 students put this together, and they did magnificent black and white photographs of life amongst Black students at Hamilton College. It could be in the dorms, it could be in other places and so forth. They were unawares of it. It was naturally shooting them with music behind it. And so in a sense, my course is called Differencing the Visible, African American Art and the Black Experience. And they took that idea and had it, it's the Black Experience at Hamilton College. But again, it's using this technology in a way that it has not been used before. It just allows for, as it's called, it's a multimodal narrative, and each one enhances, complements the other in telling, quote unquote, the story.
It's interesting how you mentioned applying new technology into those classrooms. Do you think using those technologies supports your instructional goals, pedagogy, and teaching objectives?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, when I first began to do this, particularly with digital technology, I had to adjust my teaching. Because instead of just having a slide projected on the wall, I could create something where there's text and image, and more than that, and most recently, like in the case of landscape painting, I can actually take students into the world of the painting, move around, go into details. My expression is I literally want you, and literally and figuratively want you to see what I'm saying.
See the viewpoint of someone else.
Exactly. And so, to me, this technology is robust,
right.
A tool for us to use. And it is really not simply as an add-on to lecture in the classroom, but I want to think through the medium, this powerful medium, in terms of what it can offer. Think like it's a language, and you speak within the language. And here it is thinking through the capabilities, both within the constraints and the enabling affordances of this technology to realize ends which I did not think of, or could not think of before knowing something about this technology.
So it seems that using the technology, you're able to engage more with the students and actually understand what they're doing.
Yes.
How are you able to rate and evaluate their works if they're using technology?
See, this is very good. That's a good question. And I'm not so much evaluating their use of the technology as technicians,
right?
You see, but it's looking at and carefully observing the way in which they employed it to tell their story. How does the image work with the text? How does the music enhance that? And it's always editing, like any type of formal expression and so forth. But it is new. I quite agree with you. But what's important here is looking at the quality of what they're saying through this new medium and how they use it to say that. And we'll evaluate it on the basis of that, and not simply, just simply throwing in all the bells and whistles for the technology that they're employing.
I would like to change the mood a little bit and talk about an exhibition you actually curated in the Welland Museum of Art. What do you think is the significance of providing that kind of experience to the Hamilton community? Is it relevant to a course you're teaching?
Good question. The exhibition you're referring to, which is presently on in the Welland Museum of Art, it's entitled Karen Hampton, The Journey North. She's an African-American woman who I met almost by accident. We have a mutual friend who invited both of us to her home in the Poconos. I didn't know she was going to be there. She didn't know I was going to be there. And this was about 5 years ago. And so we're talking. I said, well, what do you do? She said she's an artist. I said, oh, I'd love to see your art. So she went to the car and took out one of her pieces. And she's beautiful, weaving, stitching, working with silk organza. And for 3 days, we walked in the woods talking about art. It was wonderful. And I said, when we build a museum finally at Hamilton College, I'm going to have you in it. And here it is.
And you kept that promise.
And what's remarkable about her and her work, she sees herself as a storyteller, or the African term is griot, but she's also a trained ethnographer. She has a degree in that. So what she looks at is her own genealogy, going back to the period of slavery. And she researches that in terms of letters she can find, images and so forth, which she then brings into her art, transferring these photographs, old photographs, onto silk organza, stitching, and she's an excellent stitcher, I don't know the technical terms, but the letters that have been written by family, she stitches onto the material she's working with, and then she places these circular shapes there, which to my mind I read as she's stitching her story into their story. And it culminates beautifully in the abolitionist room. And when she found out where Hamilton College is, she said, this is ground zero for the Underground Railroad, Senegal Falls, Frederick Douglass, Katie Stanton, this area. So it is just wonderful to have this here. And I did it for that purpose, but it was also, in a sense, maybe one of the sole motivations to actually give a course in African American art. My specialty is not that, but it has been a transformative experience to teach this, because it's not just teaching the art. That's why I call it differencing the visible, making visible a people and an experience that was invisible to American culture, to the rest of the culture. And so having the exhibition with my class now is a dream come true.
That sounds perfect. I actually have one last question for you. Do you agree with the statement that students are unfamiliar with instructional technology and your technology?
This is interesting. What I have found, they're pretty savvy, but they only see it on the consuming end. They're very good at, Facebook, text messaging, things like that. But basically, it's a passive use of it. It's accessing it. But how to make it work for us.
Applying it.
Exactly. But they're very quick to learn. But in other words, when my students use this new technology for their presentations, I tell them, maybe this is the first time you're going to be the author of your knowledge and not just simply the consumer. And that's what I'd like to move more and more towards. This powerful medium, the computer, should enable us to do things we could not do before. Not just simply to be a repository for data. That's why I tell my students, it's unfortunate we call this an information age. I want to see it work for us and extend our ability to think about the problems of the world.
Those are great words. Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.